So there are few westerns that have left us with more unanswered questions than High Plains Drifter, with the biggest being who was the mysterious, vengeful force of nature known only as the Stranger. So let's try and solve this mystery once and for all, by breaking down the two most popular theories about the film, and how Clint Eastwood has since completely turned the debate on its head. So the main theory that most people subscribe to is that the Stranger is in fact the vengeful spirit of Lago's recently deceased marshal, Jim Duncan. And the thinking behind this is that the marshal was brutally whipped to death by outlaws, while the townspeople just stood back and watched, before later burying him in an unmarked grave. And following this, a mysterious rider seems to appear out of nowhere, materializing from the shimmering desert heat like a ghost. The nameless drifter then rides straight into Lago, as the locals stop to stare, looking as if they recognize him. And it's here that we get our first hint of who the Stranger might be, because when he hears the unexpected crack of a bullwhip behind him, he immediately turns his head, as if recalling the sound of the weapon that was used to kill him in a past life. On top of this, during a scene where the Stranger is trying to sleep, you can actually see the face of the dead marshal morph over his, seeming to suggest that they are in fact the same person, as he proceeds to have flashbacks to the night of his murder. The Drifter then reveals himself to be a skilled marksman, and seems utterly fearless in the face of death, almost as if he no longer has any reason to fear it. What's also telling is that during his stay in Lago, he shows no great affinity for its residents, only agreeing to help them as a means of killing the outlaws responsible for his own murder, which is pretty much exactly how you would expect a resurrected Jim Duncan to act, especially considering the circumstances of his death. After all, it's a widely held belief in many cultures that spirits tend to be tied to the location of their demise, unable to move on to the other side, due to some sort of unfinished business in their past lives. So in the case of Jim Duncan, you would imagine he'd have a desire to return to Lago and bring those who murdered him to justice, while also making the cowardly townspeople pay for not helping him. And at the climax of the movie, this is more or less exactly what plays out, as the Stranger leaves the culpable townspeople high and dry, at the moment that they needed his help the most, while making it abundantly clear where he intends to send the guilty outlaws, ultimately enacting his revenge with the very same weapon that they used to kill him. And with the deed done, the Stranger rides out of town, just as abruptly as he arrived, stopping only for Mordecai to share a telling exchange.
I never did know your name.
Yes, you do.
So as the camera pans back to reveal the gravestone of Jim Duncan, this seems to all but confirm that the Drifter was the marshal all along, now avenged and memorialized, allowing him to cross over to the other side, while Dee Barton's haunting score swells in the background, as if to hammer home the point that the Drifter was not of this world. Now there are a few other common theories around the paranormal nature of the Drifter, such as him being a manifestation of the town's collective guilt, or even the devil himself. But either way, it seems perfectly reasonable for anybody watching the film to conclude that the movie has some sort of supernatural component, with the script at times all but teasing as much.
You know, at a distance, you'd almost pass for a man.
Yet despite all of this, when Clint Eastwood first set out to make the movie, he actually had no intention of making the plot seem supernatural in the slightest, which happens to form the basis of the second most popular theory about the identity of the Stranger. So according to an early version of the script, the character Clint Eastwood plays was actually always meant to be the sibling of the dead marshal, with him even admitting in his biography that I always played it like he was the brother. Now, as hard as it is to believe that High Plains Drifter is actually just a straight-up revenge western, it does actually make a lot of sense. Because in practice, this means that the Stranger that rides to town is nothing more than a drifter, just like the title of the film implies, skilled with a gun and unafraid of danger, but still a mortal man nonetheless, in this case a brother looking to avenge his murdered sibling. And although there's no clear confirmation of this family link in the film, there are subtle hints to it.
It is inhuman, brother, inhuman.
I'm not your brother.
We are all brothers in the eyes of God.
So according to the original script, the Stranger seeks out Lago not as someone that used to live there, but as a newcomer out for revenge against those who killed his brother. So this would suggest that when he first rides through town, the staring locals aren't necessarily recognizing him as Jim Duncan, but are simply taken back by how much the stranger resembles him, while clearly being a different person. Also, when the stranger hears the crack of the bullwhip, he isn't actually recalling it from his past life, but rather looking out for the culprits responsible for killing his brother, clearly having heard that the murder weapon was a whip. This also explains why he treats the locals so harshly, as he has no real shared history or allegiance with them, opting to treat them with the same lack of compassion and respect that they showed his brother.
You're the one who could use a lesson in manners.
This theory also gives new context to the nightmares that the stranger suffers about the night of the murder, as what he sees aren't actually memories of his, but rather bad dreams about what he heard happen to his brother. So this scene is simply there to signal to the audience that the stranger already knows the truth about what happened to Jim Duncan that night, and is not actually implying that they're the same person. It's also important to note that Clint Eastwood doesn't play the marshal in these scenes like you would expect him to, if in fact the drifter and the marshal were meant to be the same person. Instead, Jim Duncan is played by Eastwood's longtime stunt double Buddy Van Horn, who's an obvious casting choice for his brother, given that they do look alike, but not enough to be mistaken as the same person up close. This would also explain why when Sarah directly references the marshal being buried in an unmarked grave, the stranger doesn't seem concerned or sensitive about the topic, as he really isn't Jim Duncan. Even the overtly biblical themes aren't all that supernatural when you really think about it. For instance, painting the town red and calling it hell could have just been a case of theatrics from the stranger, who had already shown himself to be that way inclined throughout the film, and is well aware that the locals are very superstitious religious people. So all of the biblical motifs could have simply been an intimidation tactic, with a view to terrify the outlaws, to make it easier for him to single-handedly pick them off, and avoid getting outnumbered like his brother. Now, as for the final scene where the stranger tells Mordecai that he already knows who he is, as much as it seems like he's confessing to being the dead marshal, with this new context, it could instead be taken to mean that he's saying Mordecai and us as the audience now have enough clues to figure out that he's actually the brother, especially as their shared surname appears on screen just seconds later. Equally, the final shot where the stranger rides into the distance isn't necessarily overtly supernatural, as it really is only the accompanying score that makes it seem as if something unexplainable has just happened. And for those reasons, there are some who still interpret High Plains Drifter as nothing more than a grounded revenge western that just happens to feature subtle biblical and supernatural undertones. So when you put all of this together, it would suggest that neither of the leading theories about the stranger's identity are necessarily right or wrong, because although they give the movie a completely different context depending on which one you align with, both interpretations are equally valid, and don't contradict each other. As a matter of fact, years later, Clint Eastwood all but confirmed this to be the case in a rare interview, saying,
"As it was written, you knew it was that the guy who comes back was the brother of the murdered sheriff." That was the thing, but I'd made it very ambiguous so the audience could draw in their own conclusions to it. Was this some sort of mythical deal? Was this some sort of apparition?
On top of this, in his biography, despite admitting that he believed he was playing the brother all along, Eastwood did also say, "I thought about playing it a little bit like he was a sort of avenging angel too." So essentially, this confirms that the stranger was in fact the brother of Jim Duncan, or at least to begin with, explaining why Eastwood opted to hire his stunt double to play the marshal instead of doing it himself, and why he didn't include any scenes that categorically proved that something supernatural was at play. However, clearly at some point in its production, Eastwood, being a young, daring director, realized that there was an opportunity for him to experiment with different genres, and do something that hadn't really been done before in a western. So he deliberately injected ambiguous biblical and supernatural themes into the plot that were intended to leave the audience questioning the reality of everything they'd just seen, much like Mordecai as he watches the stranger disappear on the horizon. So the beauty of of Eastwood's final line is that it wasn't necessarily a confirmation of some big twist, but rather an open invitation for you to interpret the film whatever way you want. Because the truth is that even Clint Eastwood himself no longer knows the true identity of the character he played, because he was convinced that the movie would be a whole lot more memorable if there wasn't one, which clearly proved to be the case, as we're still discussing the film over 50 years later. But let me know below, what was your personal interpretation of the film when you first saw it, and who do you think the stranger was? Also, if you liked this video, you might want to check out this one, where I try to answer who was the preacher in Pale Rider.